Good afternoon, and welcome, and thank you for joining us today for the Board Development Series webinar, The Future of Education Policy in Michigan. The timing for this could not have been better since the legislation finalized the state budget for next year this week. So we're grateful for that. I want to share a few logistic items with everyone before we begin today. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available for you soon on our website. When the webinar concludes, you will see an evaluation that comes up on your screen. We ask that you complete this brief survey as we take feedback into consideration for our future events. And then if at any time you have any questions you'd like to ask the presenters, or please utilize the question and answer feature at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. We also are going to have time set aside for questions at the end of this webinar. So with that, I'm very pleased to have Brad Wever. Brad has been engaged in policy development and the legislative process for over a decade. Brad currently serves as the Deputy Policy Director for the Republican Caucus in the Michigan House of Representatives, where he advises legislators on public policy with a focus on education issues. Welcome, Brad. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hi, thanks a lot. I appreciate it. As Shannon said, my name is Brad Wever. I am the Deputy Director for the House Republican Policy Office, and I focus and specialize in education policy and the school aid budget. I also used to work at CMU, so I was a proud employee of the CMU Center for Charter Schools for 5.5 years as the Director of Public Policy. So I'm well versed in the world of charter schools and charter school authorizing, and I loved my time at CMU. But I'm back in the legislature now, and in addition to being the Deputy Policy Director, I'm also a father of 3. One is in college now, and I have 2, one in high school and one in elementary school. And I'm also a board member of my local school district where I live in DeWitt. So I see education from all different angles as a parent, a board member, and as a policy maker or advisor. So really happy to be here today and present this to you. The presentation is going to mainly focus on the school aid budget because that is kind of the issue of the hour and really of the year, just given everything that's happened with COVID, the pandemic, and just the economy in general. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit. But when I sat down over the past couple of days to think about this presentation and how I wanted to kind of bring this to all of you, is there's a lot of great things that are out there. You probably read some of the news reports about no funding cuts and no major reductions out there and new programs or things being sustained, whereas a few months ago, it was a very different story. But what I want to try to convey is, yes, things look okay now, but we should really be cautious moving forward. So I titled this A Cautionary Tale. As I mentioned, I did a similar presentation for the wonderful folks at MAPSA last spring. I think it was late spring, maybe early summer. And I had a very different title for my presentation at that time. And I called it the good, the bad, and the ugly. And then I just crossed out the good because there was really nothing good at that point in time. It was nothing but bad news in May and June when the state released its revenue numbers. $3 billion deficit for fiscal year 21, $1.5 billion, I think, for the current year. I mean, it was really bad. And what that led to is, hey, we really need to kind of put the brakes on figuring out the budget, because we need to see how the next few months play out in terms of the economy, how long COVID was going to last, what the impact was going to be, were people going to go back to work. So the state and the legislature and the governor's office had an agreement to really hold off until August when they held another revenue estimating conference. And that really showed, at the time, there was $43 billion in federal aid that flowed down to the state. And that was in the form of direct aid to state government, direct aid to individuals through unemployment, through just other incentives that the feds had pushed down to businesses. So $43 billion from the federal government really helped to prop up our economy and really helped state revenues be maintained for the most part. But so August painted a very different picture than what May did. So two totally different stories were being told, at least from a state revenue standpoint. So, but still, I decided to go with a cautionary tale for this presentation, but that's, again, much better than what things were back in the late spring. But to dive into things, there's really, this budget year was a little strange because it was almost a budget in two parts. And the first part was return to learn. And that was, you probably started to see things come out around the 4th of July, maybe a little bit before that, of, hey, we need to really start thinking about next school year and what next school year looks like. Because we don't know if kids are going to be able to go safely back into buildings. They might be online again. We need to start figuring this out as policymakers, because those in schools were asking those questions and saying, how is this going to work? So the governor's office put out an executive order that really focused on the health and safety aspects of school. The legislature shortly after that, or around the same time, proposed what they called a return to learn plan. And this was their approach to provide school districts with maximum flexibility, with some accountability measures built into it. What that eventually led to was in August, negotiating between the legislature and the governor's office on what ended up being a 3-bill package that was dubbed Return to Learn. And that really set the framework for this year. There was no dollars attached to it, so it wasn't a budget bill, but it affected budget items. And you'll see that as I kind of go through these things. And really, this was the way for, it was the pathway forward for schools to figure out, should we be online? Should we be in person? How can we be online and in person at the same time for certain families to meet their needs? And those were all things that we had to work through, because our policy system right now, at least from a state policy and a state funding aspect, is built on kids being able to be in schools. For the large majority of kids in schools out there, that's how our system is built. So we needed to rethink everything, from how do we count instructional time? How do we make sure that teaching and learning is actually happening? How do you count pupils? How do you count kids when they're not in a building? So those were all challenges that we needed to overcome, and that really preempted the budget process, the budget that passed earlier this week. So these, what you see on the screen now, these are a couple of the things that we tackled there. Instructional time. Typically, instructional time is the amount of time that a kid is in a seat. And again, I'm speaking in broad generalities. I understand that there's cyber schools and there's blended learning models and there's all kinds of different things, but the large majority of schools and students in this state are counted, or we count instructional time, and that equals to 180 days and 1,098 hours of a student being in a seat. So we needed to rethink that a little bit. And what we came up with on instructional time in an online environment, or a hybrid or in person, was that districts just needed to offer the same amount of instructional time as what they would during a typical year. And the key word here is offer. So in the past, a teacher standing up there with kids in there, that's all counted as instructional time. Now, kids might be online, some might be in person. Some kids might just not show up because they don't have internet access or whatever issues they may have. They may be learning through a distance learning where packets are being sent home. But this was setting a bar for just making sure that there was some instruction happening. The other part of it, and this was the administration, the governor's office, big ask, was they wanted some financial stability for districts. And they were rarely concerned about the number of kids that were going to move to homeschooling. Parents just didn't feel safe sending their kids physically into a building. They were worried about kids moving to private schools, moving to cyber schools, cyber charter schools specifically. That was a big concern of theirs. So 75-25 was really a way to create stability in the system by weighting the pupil count to last year at 75% and only 25% for this year. So that gives you some sort of blend. We're calling it a super blend, if you will, of students that eases that financial hit that districts would take. So 75-25 was a negotiated item. Honestly, we talked about 50-50, we talked about 80-20, we talked about a whole bunch of things. 75-25 is ultimately where we landed. So funding for this next year is based 75% off of your fall 2019 blended count and 25% on your fall 2020 blended count. So it's really technical, but they're important things when you as board members and administrators start looking at budgets for this next year and how things are going to be impacted. Well, you've already passed budgets for this year, how you amend budgets for this year. So the other thing that we really looked at was in a typical school year, attendance is measured. So in order to count one of those days of instruction, you need to have 75% of your students in attendance. It was a simple way for the legislature to say, look, if you got half the kids in the building, should that really count as an instructional day? So they set the bar at 75%. And in a typical year, it's usually not that hard for districts to hit that bar. But again, no kids in the building. How do you measure that? We took a page out of the playbook of cyber charter schools, and they have a way of looking at interactions, these two-way interactions between teachers and students, and that could be some sort of way to measure engagement between teachers and students, and could we count that? And that was really the way what it kind of developed out of was using that cyber charter school model and applying that to all schools. And we kind of agreed we didn't want a way to count pupils just for online schools, and then a different way to count pupils when they were sitting in schools, and a different way for counting a hybrid model. By just simply counting all kids the same way, no matter what mode of instruction they are in, that we felt that was the most equitable way. So these two-way interactions were implemented at various points, throughout just the school accountability and pupil accounting processes to help the state kind of measure those things, but also make sure that schools are engaging with students. In counting pupils, again, the same challenge. Difficult to count those pupils. Again, we took a page out of the cyber charter school playbook. Cyber charter schools have a 4-week counting window where that pupil, you need to engage with that pupil once a week for that 4-week period in order to count them towards your membership. So there's a few other ways that it can be done, but that's one of the ways. And we thought that was a good model to use to apply to all schools. If you're in person, two-way interactions, pretty easy to meet. teachers there engaging with the student face-to-face online. There's still some rules that are being promulgated or just figured out at the MDE level, and how exactly and what those interactions can look like. But we felt that this was a pretty good way to make sure that there was teaching and learning happening, but that we could also use as a way to count how many kids are in buildings, because we need those numbers in order to build the state budget. The final part of this is really, and I think charter schools maybe have a little bit less of a problem with this, but it was an issue we saw in a lot of traditional districts and areas that don't have a higher concentration of charter schools, is parent engagement. I think during this time, for the past 2 months, in the 10 plus years I've been working specifically in education policy, I don't think we've seen a time where parents are more engaged in their students' education. It's sad to say, but I think there's a large percentage of parents that are now starting to say, hey, why aren't there more options? Why can't I choose something else in this area? Why are we going to be online versus in person? I think they've just started to ask a lot more questions, and we wanted to make sure as policymakers that their voices were heard. And the ways that came out was board members having to reaffirm or recertify their mode of instruction on a monthly basis. And this was something, it's a simple way for parents to engage their board, their local community, their schools, decision-making body with what data are you using to keep, why are we staying online, and what kind of data are you using to make those decisions? And we really wanted to empower those parents and engage them in that process. And that's just one example of what we've done through the Return to Learn package. But that's kind of the broad overview of Return to Learn, and that's important to understand kind of as we go into the budget process. On the funding side, these are some things, and honestly, it's been difficult to track, even somebody who's paid to track this stuff every day. But there was a lot of different moving parts this summer. I think we had 3 or 4 different supplemental budget bills just to deal with a lot of the federal funding that was coming through. This summer, you saw a $175 per pupil reduction to your school aid. It was not a reduction to your foundation grant. It was a reduction to just your overall state aid payment. But that was counterbalanced with a $350 per pupil increase, and that was using the Federal CARES Act dollars. Now, there are some restrictions tied to that $350 that restricts the way that funding can be used. We tried to keep it as broad as possible, and I know the accounting folks are probably working overtime to try to figure out how to account for all of this stuff. But we used that money in order to help with those COVID-related expenses that a lot of districts had. There were other funding efforts that happened throughout the summer. There was another $18 million that went out to districts on a per pupil basis. That was really meant for PPE. It could be used for benchmark assessments. It was a really long list of what that funding could be used for. And I think that funding went out, and it had to go out by late July. So that's just a couple of things that happened leading up to the fiscal year 21 budget that we'll talk about now. So the main points of the budget, so no major reductions in any line items. There's some line items that were eliminated, kind of small potatoes compared to the kind of main funding point. And then just get used to talking about the percentage of a percentage, because there's a lot of that. And it's going to be difficult, and you're going to need to push your finance people a little bit to draw all this out probably to help understand kind of how the funding is going to flow, because there are multiple instances that use multiple different percentages against a percentage. So it's confusing, but I'll do my best to try to explain it to you. And then the last thing I think that's really exciting and should be helpful to a lot of charter schools is there's an incentive for new teachers. I think one of the things that the legislatures recognized is that new teacher pay, new teachers coming into the profession are not getting compensated in the way that they should. This is a small way to help those districts compensate those new teachers. And we'll get into the details of that a little bit more, but certainly helps to address the teacher shortage that's out there. And it's one way to help address that. So per pupil funding, it's important to note that the foundation grant itself has not changed. So the foundation grant for those at the minimum is still $8,111, and at the high end is $8,529. That is the same as what it was in fiscal year 20. It will be the same in fiscal year 21. Now keep in mind, I showed you the slide earlier, there was that $175 reduction to your state aid. It did not reduce the foundation grant. So foundation grant remains the same. Also keep in mind that what they're going to base that foundation grant off is 75% of your students from last year, 25% of 25% of your students from this year. So there's an important distinction there. You can't just look at the kids that you have this fall, multiply that by 8,111 and be done. There's a little bit more math that's going to have to go into that. And again, make sure you talk to your finance people to help you work through that. The other part is there was an additional $65 per pupil. Again, not built into the foundation grant. It's just an extra $65 per pupil. And I put estimated on there, and here's why. So that number is going to be based off of 50% of this fall's count and 50% of last year's count. So again, we got to work out the weighting and everything here. And there's going to be, that's why I said percentages of percentages, because it's different for all of these different pots of money. And the reason why for this is there was different views of this $65. The governor's office viewed this as a reinstatement of part of the $175 that was reduced in last fiscal year. So they wanted it based off of last fiscal year's numbers. The legislature thought funding should follow the student and we should restore based on this year's students. So they split the difference 50-50. I would also note for those districts out there that are growing, I know the 75-25 was an issue for a lot of those districts. There is a growing districts categorical for those districts that are going to see increased enrollment. One of the complaints of 75-25 is if you had 10 more students than you had last year, you were only going to get those students would only be weighted at 25% of their count. So they were not, you would not have received full funding for that student. Under the fiscal year 21 budget, that funding you will be made whole for all of those students that you have above and beyond what you had last year. That's an important thing for growing districts out there. These are some of the major categorical areas that were out there, and I just wanted to note those. The Great Start Readiness Program, if you operate a GSRP program, there's no funding changes. It's still going to be at the FY20 level for funding, but there's an important caveat for GSRP. GSRP, there was a lot of concern from the field that if we continued to fund those programs on a per student basis or a per pupil basis, that the students wouldn't show up. Some GSRP programs are already on the brink of bankruptcy. They're being funded through local districts. So what we did to address that problem is we're now expanding eligibility. So typically, you've got to meet certain thresholds of having a certain number of students at a certain level of the poverty threshold. Now you can continue to raise that threshold in order to fill all of the slots within your GSRP programs. The policy goal of this is really simple. We wanted to make sure that all of the spots that could be filled would be filled at this point. So we just wanted to make sure that the services could be delivered to as many kids as possible, and expanding eligibility was one of the easiest ways we could do that. There still needs to be a focus on lower income students, but eligibility will be expanded, and that's for 1 year. There's only going to be a 1-year expansion of that. For at-risk funding, a lot of charter schools would be receiving this. There's no changes there, no changes in the eligibility, no changes in the funding levels. Early literacy has been a huge focus for the last 4, 5, 6 years of the legislature. That funding was expanded once again. I think there's an additional $4 million in those line items. That's going to really go for literacy coaches. Well, there's already literacy coaches. I'm sorry. It's going to go for professional development for the literacy coaches. Last year, you might remember, the legislature tripled the funding for early literacy programs. This is another $4 million to make sure that all of those literacy coaches are getting proper professional development. So when you're having those conversations with the ISD about what services and bringing the literacy coaches into your buildings, make sure they're getting the professional development too. So other changes, and we'll just call this potpourri. One of the major issues I heard, especially from a lot of the NHA run schools, was the monthly versus every 30 days. So I know for a lot of you board members out there, it's probably a big deal. The intent when we passed Return to Learn was to have the boards recertify on a monthly basis their mode of instruction. And it got in there as 30 days. And I think, anyways, it's fixed. So it's monthly board meetings that you need to recertify the mode of instruction. There's also an additional reporting requirement for districts to report those to the state in a kind of common form, but your administrator should be able to help out with that. Finally, the next part is the two-way interactions. When I mentioned these earlier, it was specific to interactions between a teacher and a pupil. Now those interactions can be between a teacher or another employee who is responsible for the student's academic progress. And this really came from a lot of folks who were saying, look, we're online, we're part online, we're part in person, we're stretched a little thin on the staffing side. We've got as many people as we can. We're having a hard time just tracking down kids. So can we get a little bit of leeway here on those two-way interactions, and who can actually who can do it in order for it to count? So there is a little bit of freedom that's allowed there. So that's something that we definitely heard from the field. The other thing that you might have been, I've been getting a lot of questions about this, especially in the last few days, is hazard pay for teachers. There was one of the previous budget bills that passed earlier this summer. You may have heard of a $500 per teacher hazard pay payment, and those payments have not gone through yet. And what the budget did just 2 days ago was it switched the funding source. So what was done earlier this summer was it used the Federal CARES Act dollars in order to fund these $500 payments to teachers for hazard pay. That money has been switched to general fund because there was some question of whether or not that was an allowable use of those federal funds. So to clear things up, to get the money out the door, that will now be general fund dollars that will go out to districts probably very soon. So you should look forward to seeing those too. I would also note there was a new section added. There is a $250 hazard pay payment for paraprofessionals. And so just keep an eye out for that as well, because that was something else that we heard. And then finally, these new teacher retention stipends. This is something I mentioned at the beginning. This is a $5 million pot of money. And essentially, this is either a $500 or a $1,000 payment from the state to a district for any teacher that's within their first 3 years of teaching. The district has the responsibility to match that up to $500. So the district has a little bit of skin in the game. So teachers, new teachers in their first 3 years of teaching would be eligible for these payments of up to $1,500. But again, up to $1,000 coming from the state and $500 coming from the district. Now, what's the difference between $500 and $1,000 coming from the state? The $500 is for every teacher. The $1,000 is if the teacher is teaching in a district that has more than 70% of their students that are economically disadvantaged. And I think that would be a lot of charter schools. So this is something that you're definitely going to want to ask some questions about, definitely going to want to focus on for your next board meeting to make sure that this money, that there's money set aside for this locally at your budget so that this funding can be pulled down and you can get those teachers that extra payment. So any teacher in their first 3 years, if you're over 70%, it jumps up a little bit more, but the district's got to have a little bit of skin in the game. And again, this is purely focused on keeping new teachers in the classroom, retaining them, making sure that they feel supported and that they get a little bit of that boost, coming into the profession. There's no caveat on how old they are. They don't have to be out of college. This can be somebody switching careers and moving into the profession. But it should be relatively easy to administrate, but I think it's going to be a real benefit to charter schools.
Brad, we have a quick question related back a couple slides related back
Sure.
to the $65 per pupil.
Yep.
Is it considered part of the per pupil state aid formula, correct? Or in other words, our state funding per pupil this year is determined by taking that 8,111.75/25 super blend plus 65 times the 50/50 super blend.
Yes. I think. So foundation grant is 8,111. That's what it's going to be for charter schools.
Correct.
You take 75% of last year's pupils, 25% of this year's pupils, blend those together, multiply that by 8,111. That's your state aid payment. For the $65, you take 50% of this fall's and 50% of last fall's, blend those two together. So you basically just take the average of those two, multiply it by 65. That's your payment under this line item.
Perfect. Thank you. Is that good, Heather? Just want to make sure that that was clear and we don't need to look into that a little bit more as far as clarification. Thank you, Brad.
Yeah. And then just to wrap up a little bit here, looking ahead, and this is why this presentation is called the cautionary tale, because quite honestly, like, there hasn't been a whole lot of bad news in the presentation up until now. But here's the bad news, or the potential bad news. We don't know what the impact of COVID is going to be. From this is Brad Wever, just the guy. I'm not basing this off of anything other than my gut. Is we are going to be in this for a while. I think this entire school year is going to be affected by this, which means that the economy is going to be continued to be affected by this. As I stated before, the state revenues that we are expecting for this year are based off of $43 billion in federal aid coming into this state. I don't know if that's going to continue. And that could lead to dramatic revenue declines that we don't know. I started this presentation off by talking about May versus August, and that was two totally different stories. As we sit here in September 2020, by May, by December, who knows? May or December, it could be a very different story, which could affect state revenues, which ultimately affects your budgets. We don't know how fast the economy is going to recover. You hear businesses are shutting down. From what the economists are saying, the $43 billion that came into the state helped putter things along. We don't know if those unemployment claims or those unemployment benefits are going to continue for a lot of individuals. We don't know if they're going to have jobs to return to. So that will dictate a lot of what happens over the next year. This is going to be a long recovery. For those of you that were around in the late 2000s, that was a tough road. There were some tough budget years. I don't want to say lucky, but I think this year is a gift of a budget. And that I think future years, you should be planning for not so great of times, to be honest with you. If you take a look at it from a different lens, the House of Representatives in Michigan is facing an election in November. They did not want to vote on budget cuts a month and a half before an election. The Democrats didn't want to either. Nobody wants to. Nobody wants to vote on budget cuts anyway, but especially a month and a half before an election. Next year, no election. Things might be a totally different story. We are expecting some revenue decline next year. The economists just don't know what things are going to look like, and what kind of federal aid we get is largely dependent upon this, and how fast the economy recovers is largely dependent upon this. So that's my kind of doom and gloom to end this presentation, and I don't mean to end it that way, but I think it's important for you all to hear that while this is a great budget, and I think everybody's happy and breathing a sigh of relief, don't let that set in for too long. Look closely at your budgets. Look closely at what your spending is going to be, and think about that future. Make sure you've got good fund balances, because those are going to take a hit. I know in our school district, where I voted on a $500 per pupil reduction, a budget based on a $500 per pupil reduction. I'm thankful that we can restore a lot of that for this year, but when we go back in to vote on those budget amendments, I don't think we're going to be able to restore all of it, because I'm going to be very concerned about the next school year and what that looks like, and can we sustain a lot of this. So that's my cautionary tale for the day, and I don't mean to end it on a negative note, but again, I think it's important for all to hear. This is my contact information. This is my personal email and my personal cell phone number. You can write it down. You can call me. You can text me. You can email me. I'm happy to answer your questions. You can also talk to the wonderful people at the center. Jason Mancini is a phenomenal public policy director. And all the folks there are just great, and they can help you walk through this, and they can help get in contact with me if they have any questions. But that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody might have. I don't know if you got any more, Shannon, that were in the chat, but fire away.
Yep. Thank you so much. So I have a follow-up question. The clarification on the $65, Brad, is that going to be considered state aid or catechol funding? And this kind of comes from the idea that some schools have management partnerships, and their fees are based on, certain types of funding. So do you know, can you say how that will be?
It's technically a categorical
Okay.
So it's not part of the state aid payment. And I don't know how the MDE is going to account for that and how they flow the money down, but it's not built into that foundation grant. So it's a separate line item completely.
And
I think that, I
most
hope
likely
that
that will
answers.
be identified on the financial status report that the schools received to kind of show
Yeah.
that.
It'll show up as a totally different payment.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, we've got a couple questions. So the first one goes back to the teacher retention stipends.
Yep.
The district has contributed. It says, does the district contribution have to be $500?
Yes.
Okay.
But the idea was there's not a sliding scale or anything like that. It is $500 from the district to either receive that $500 from the state or the $1,000 if they're an eligible district.
Perfect. And then for the first year teachers, are part of the both $500 incentive? So the first one would be new teachers and the second one would be teachers in the first 3 years. Are they both part of that incentive?
Yeah, it would be any teacher within the first 3 years. Essentially what's going to happen is the MDE is going to print off a report because they know, based on the Registry of Educational Personnel, who's teaching in what district. And they will print that off. They'll send it to the district. The district will say, yes, we're going to do this incentive for these individuals because we've allocated the money for this, and then send it back to the MDE. MDE will cut the checks to the districts.
Perfect. Great. Thank you. Okay, so the next one is about hazard pay and how will that come to the districts?
The way that's coming to the
categorical?
I don't think it's coming through. It would come through as a categorical, and I think the restrictions on it are it needs to flow through the regular payroll system. So it comes down as a separate item in how it flows to the districts and then flows out to teachers from there through the payroll system.
So do you know what the source of the data would be? Would it be the rep or?
That's a good question that I have not been able to get answered. Is I don't even know what it's based off of. I don't know if it's based off of teachers from last year or teachers from this year. So that is an unknown at this point and an answer we've been trying to get from Treasury.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, and then just one more thing about teacher evaluation. What is the status on teacher evaluations?
I'm going to just punt on this one. Nothing has happened on teacher evaluation, unfortunately. I think there's a lot of unanswered questions at this point, and those would really be in the areas of teacher evaluation, third grade reading. I mean, what do all these things look like during this COVID year? And obviously, last year the governor waived all those things by executive order. There were some folks that were upset about that who wanted to see them move forward. I suspect, looking into my crystal ball, that things will probably get waived again this year. But I can tell you that the governor's office has had some hesitancy on going out unilaterally on education issues. I think there is a genuine willingness, and I'm a partisan legislative staffer. So, but I do believe that there is a willingness from the governor's office to work with the legislature on items like this. But I still predict, just given new legislature coming in January, I don't know if things will be worked out quick enough in order to affect. I don't know if things will work out quick enough in order for a legislative fix for teacher evaluations and the third grade retention requirements. I would urge districts to move forward with their evaluations as is. We are in a new world right now. Clearly, I think this would have probably been a face-to-face webinar. Well, not a webinar, a face-to-face presentation. But we're in a different day and age. I attended a parent-teacher conference for the first time last night via Zoom. So things can be done. I mean, there are ways to do this, and I think if COVID has taught us anything, is we need to rethink the way that we're approaching a lot of things. And I think there is a way for districts to do evaluations, but those should be worked out with your teachers, and there should be clear expectations of what's going to happen. So,
perfect. Thank you. Any other questions that we have out there before we wrap it up today? I'll give you a couple seconds to see if anyone wants to type anything in. This is the time to stump the presenter.
CMU knows me well enough that I'll just talk around it anyway. So.
All right, so it doesn't seem like we have any. Well, Brad, I want to thank you for taking time today to join us and provide this update and overview. It's always great hearing from you. I want to thank all of our partners that are out there that have joined us for this webinar today. It was great to be able to spend this time with you. Remember, before you sign off today, to complete the evaluation. We use this information to help us, especially for planning going forward. We always want to be able to provide opportunities for you to learn more and get up-to-date information. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you at the next webinar as soon as we can get one planned. And we hope everyone has a great weekend. Stay safe out there, and thanks for all you do. Thank you, Brad.
Thanks, everyone.